Guitarists, of course, are likely to be well versed in all the different types of amp designs around and the various controls in them, with their slightly different layouts and responses. But recordists and mixers who may be using virtual amps based on them might not be able to get the best response out of those models without at least a little familiarity with the originals. Lacking that knowledge can be problematic, especially when working with a guitarist who wants a specific sound, like from a certain real model or type of amp, and is frustrated that the engineer isn't able to translate when he describes his desired tone in terms of the sound provided by specific models or amps that employ specific circuit designs. Obviously, there are many situations where a high level of knowledge about guitar amp minutiae isn't really required, but it would be a mistake to go into some sessions with some artists without having done a little homework to get up to speed on the world of guitar amps and distortion. First off, let me pick up where I left off last time: gain controls and amp sims, both controls for general level adjustment, calibration of the incoming signal, and the gain or drive or volume knobs that are part of the simulation, the virtual amp's front panel itself. I talked about there often being two separate input gain controls in many amp sims. One is just for generic gain staging. It sets the level of the incoming signal before it even hits the virtual amp to calibrate that signal's level to the proper level that the simulated amps in the plugin were designed to expect and respond to most realistically. The other is the virtual gain or drive control on the amp sim's front panel, which simulates the response, in terms of distortion and feel, of the particular modeled amp in use. Well, there may also be a couple of output gain controls as well, with the same functions. One is part of the amp model itself, often labeled master volume, and adjusting it changes not just level, but the simulated distortion and tonal character of the amp simulation. The other is simply another generic final level control for setting an appropriate output level for the finished amped-up sound as it flows through the rest of the channel strip into the mix. Once again, it's important to keep the different functions of these controls in mind. You don't want to use the virtual front panel master volume knob simply to dial up a level for the output of the plugin. Doing so may unintentionally change the tone and the level and character of the distortion you'd already set up. While most sims have a separate final output knob post-simulation, if one doesn't, you can either use the channel fader for that adjustment, or if you need to tweak the plugin's final output level before it hits the next plugin in the chain, then you could insert another generic gain or trim plugin just after the modeled amp. But non-guitarists may ask, what's the purpose of the two virtual front panel gain controls in the modeled amp itself? Well, obviously they're following the layout of the real amps the models are based on. Not all real amps have two knobs, but the ones that do would have them wired in at different points in the signal flow. On the surface, the idea would have been to be able to dial up as much distortion as you wanted with the first gain or drive knob, and then set the overall output level with the second, master volume knob. But of course, it's not that simple. Each of these knobs usually adds distortion, and it can be very different sounding distortion due to their different positions in the signal flow within the actual amps. And that's also something that even non-guitarists who either record real amps or work with virtual amps that duplicate the same behavior should be familiar with. In a typical guitar amp, and a virtual amp model based on it, the signal flows through several sections. The most important of these are the input preamp section, the tone stack, the amp CQ, and the output power amp section. I'll touch on tone controls in the next video, but it's the preamp and power amp sections that are relevant here. With their classic grind and overdrive, guitar amps, of course, either utilize real tubes throughout or emulate their sound scrupulously. The preamp and power amp sections employ different types of tubes with distinctly different overload and distortion characteristics. Most input sections utilize the 12AX7 or ECC83 or similar triode-type preamp tubes. When these are overdriven, they tend to produce a brighter, buzzier distortion that some describe as kind of fizzy in large doses. The output sections contain the power amp tubes for driving the speakers, and tend to produce a more crunchy, grinding distortion. Different amp brands and designs are known for using different specific power tubes, and they have much more distinctly different distortion characteristics than the similar preamp tubes in most amps. Amps with only one volume control push the signal into both these sections at the same time, so the combined distortion character you get is whatever was designed into the amp at the factory. But amps and virtual models with both preamp and power amp gain knobs let the user balance the blend of these different types of distortion, providing more versatile possibilities for distortion character from that amp. Guitarists may not always know all the tube and circuit details, but most of them do associate certain distortion characteristics with certain brands and models of amps. They may often request a specific distortion quality from an engineer who's dialing up a distorted guitar tone with a virtual amp for a DI guitar track in a mix, and they may be disappointed if the engineer doesn't understand the sound they're looking for when they describe it as that glassy Fender sound, or that classic Marshall grind, or that scoop dual rectifier distortion. I've had guitarists request that I emulate the sound of their favorite amp, which was some boutique model that the amp sim didn't know from. When that happens, if I can look up the types of tubes it uses and the overall layout, I'll at least have a good starting place to approximate a simulation from the available amps to satisfy the client. Fortunately, acquiring a basic familiarity with the most common amp types and models, and the most common tube types associated with each, is not too daunting. Most amps and tube types fit into a few categories that cover about 90% of the amps out there. I'll finish this discussion up with a brief rundown of them, plus a look at the contribution of the speakers and their important effect on distortion quality in the next clip.